All right, hello and welcome everyone to the Food Dialogues 2020. My name is Kurt Ackerman. I'm with the South African Food and Farming Trust, and we're pleased to host this year's Food Dialogues. Just a note for everyone who's participating that this event is being recorded, so please bear that in mind as you participate. I'm just going to say a few brief words and then hand over to our moderator, Leonie Joubert. Just in the spirit of dialogues, while we do have our moderator and our panelists who will be introduced to you shortly, we really want to hear from everyone who's participating and in attendance. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you might want to have our moderator or panelists pick up and engage with. And feel free to use the chat function for discussion of topics and to converse with one another. And if it turns out that from that emerges some questions, then I will add those into the Q&A and we'll hopefully get those fed into the conversation. So this is the first of a series of 5 live webinars or panel discussions we'll be having this week on various themes. This week's theme, or today's theme rather, is food in crisis. And we'll be following with the other 4 themes through the rest of the week. We kicked off this year's Food Dialogues with an overview presentation of Cape Town's food system on the 20th of July, and then we released 23 talks between the 27th and the 31st of July. And if you haven't had a chance to look at those, they're all on the Food Dialogues platform, which is available for viewing and at no cost at capetown.fooddialogues.info. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, the DSI-NRF Center of Excellence in Food Security and the DG Murray Trust, and our partners, the African Center for Cities, Aribi Village, the City of Cape Town, ICLEI, and Derek. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. So again, today's theme is food in crisis, and the discussion will be moderated by Leonie Joubert. She's a science writer and journalist and author of, among other books, The Hungry City, Tomatoes to Taxi Ranks, and she's quite knowledgeable about the topic, and we're looking forward to a very interesting and informative session. So with that, over to you, Leonie.
Great. Am I on? Am I live? Good. Thank you so much, Kurt. And it's delightful to be here this afternoon. Welcome to the first Q&A session of the 2020 Food Dialogues. These dialogues could really not be more urgent and could not have come at a better time. We really do need to be documenting what we've witnessed and experienced through the past 6 months while they're still very fresh in our minds. And these dialogues are an opportunity to do that. So I really want to commend Kurt and the rest of his team for pulling this whole dialogue series together so quickly and with such a thorough program, in spite of the logistical challenges of us not being able to meet and do this face-to-face. In 2014, when Kurt and his team were put together the first Food Dialogues, I was extremely fortunate in that I was able to join the team as a rapporteur and to help pull the conversation together in a report. And of course, I'm now assisting the team with the same function this time around. And it's given me a really valuable opportunity to get a high altitude perspective on these very important issues. And 2 things have struck me most, comparing this situation with the discussions from the previous Food Dialogues. And the first is just how much the thinking and ideas in the context of the food system and the hunger obesity crisis that we have, just how much that thinking has evolved. And the second thing that has struck me, and I'm sure that this is something that each one of you have said at some point in the past 4 months, how this pandemic has shown up the fault lines that were existing in our system beforehand, and how this pandemic has shattered those fault lines open. And really, we are kind of reaping the whirlwind after half a century of neoliberal economics, which has allowed the dominance of large players in the market. This has allowed profiteering by a small elite at the expense of many of the poor and the environment. It's driven greater inequality, greater vulnerability of the poor, low wages. It's driven greater austerity in many countries. So we're seeing the very safety nets that we need right now to help the poor survive. We've seen many of those stripped away in many countries around the world, like healthcare, education, social grants, etc. And this system has also allowed us to sort of externalize the environmental and the health costs of so much of our economic system. So this pandemic has shown the existing fault lines, but it also shows the kinds of restructuring of the system that we have to do in the long term, regardless of whether this pandemic happened. But because we've had to respond with such urgency and to this emergency, it's allowed us to really sharpen our thinking quite critically. These food dialogues have really helped us identify those problems and to start to think about how we redress them. Over the years, when I have given many talks either around food security issues or the climate crisis, the one question that comes up every time is, but what can I do about it? And you can't answer that with a single answer, because there is no silver bullet solution. The only way to understand this and is to look at the system, the total system, and see where your point of leverage is within that system, as an individual and as a business or within government, and you need to tailor your response to that point of leverage in the system, and then you just need to leverage the hell out of it. But the difficulty with trying to understand the system is that it's complicated, and not many of us have the time to really sink our teeth into a systems level analysis of things. So I think that's where the food dialogues comes in, because so many of the speakers' contribution throughout the recorded sessions, which I hope you've all had a chance to watch, it's highlighted cases and examples, practical solutions to how we deal with the immediate crisis of hunger, but how we start to think about the systemic restructuring we need. So that's what I would really like us to do today, to crowdsource from all of you examples of actionable solutions, whether it's at a policy level or down at a community level. So our three speakers today, in alphabetical order: Veronica Baleni, who is Veronica with us yet? We were having some trouble getting Veronica online, but Veronica is the founder and managing director of Bhukukla Farming Co-op Ltd. She's a smallholder farmer who's been she's been farming for the past 15 years. Andrew Boraine is the CEO of the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership. He's been involved in South Africa's local government, urban and economic development and transition processes for the past 35 years. And Gray Maguire is the Green Economy Coordinator with the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. It's a provincial government level. And yes, each one of these speakers, their full bio is online, which you can go and view it if you want more details. But I'd like to launch into today's discussion, starting with Andrew, because you were the first contributor on the program. One of the things you pointed out was how emergency food aid was central to relieving the immediacy of the crisis. But as you said, it's not sustainable. We can't assume that this kind of emergency response can continue if we want to redress hunger. So we need a situation where people have long-term food and nutritional security. You also mentioned that while there are things at national government level, there are policies at national government level to try and create this environment. We have in many respects, a failing state where there's dwindling state capacity and financial resources to try and deal with these sorts of emergencies. Now that the worst of the crisis is possibly being dealt with, in the longer term, what kind of enabling environment is necessary so that this kind of emergency doesn't hit us as hard in future?
Thanks, Leonie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to participate here. particularly as someone who doesn't have a food or nutrition systems background, and is perhaps an inadvertent participation in this, but we do have a partnering and systems change background. And I guess that's why myself and my organization, the EDP, has been involved in addressing some of the short-term food needs with partners in the public sector as well as civil society organizations. So how do we recover beyond the status quo? Because the status quo before the crisis was pretty dismal. As you said, all the crisis has done, Leonie, is to show up the inadequacies of our current system. And may I also say, show up the complete inadequacies of our state system. So it's not just societal fractures that have been shown up, it's also the inability of the South African state as a whole to respond coherently to something like this. So what do we have to do to recover beyond the status quo? Well, I think firstly, we've got to continue meeting current food needs, because I don't think we're out of the crisis yet. And I don't think it's an either or dichotomy, it's a both and. We've got to act now to continue to provide humanitarian aid, including food aid, to poor and vulnerable communities, and look at ways in which we can improve and transform the food system. And one of the ways we can do that is to build on the new relationships that have formed in communities and in networks of solidarity, where in a sense people have revealed the best. There's been incredible mobilization, organization, education, networking within communities, between communities, and to some extent between subnational government, I would say, and organizations of civil society, NGOs that have repurposed, faith-based organizations, ecumenical networks, intermediary organizations that have formed links with farmers. And it would be terrible if we squandered this incredible mass mobilization. I've said that it's probably the biggest mass mobilization in civil society, with backed by private donors and philanthropy and everyone else, including academics and researchers that have got on board and working with government officials, the best mobilization since the 1980s. So we can't afford to squander that level of mobilization if we want to now go on and either improve or hopefully transform the food system and the nutritional system. And so how do we carry on building that? And I think that to sustain community organizations, people need resources. We cannot, there's volunteer fatigue, donor fatigue, and I think some of those resources are locked up in municipalities. So for example, land and associated resources for food gardens and allotments. That is available in municipalities. Premises, buildings, underutilized municipal offices and things like that. I think the third thing that municipalities do is assist with the management of public space, which is so critical to organizing things at a community level, to make safer spaces and things like that. And then fourthly, just basically improving connectivity, access to Wi-Fi. For the duration of this crisis, all the public libraries have been closed down, and a lot of people in communities, poor and vulnerable communities, got their access through the local libraries. How can we get those opened up again quickly? So my final point here, Leonie, is then often those resources tend to be locked behind quite a constipated municipal or public compliance system. It's very hard for people in communities, particularly under conditions of informality, unregistered organizations, new forms of organizations, to access formal resources in the state. And I think that's why one of our ways forward is to focus on how we create a more enabling environment in local government, rather than what I would tend to call a disabling environment in local government.
You've given us a lot of meat to think about, so I want to return to some of those points shortly. Gray, I'm going to jump to you in anticipation of Veronica joining us shortly. So in the context that we now have over half of South Africans living within or very close to our cities, of course, one of the areas that is often focused on as a leverage point for food resilience is urban farming. And of course, this is an area that you've also touched on and you mentioned in your talk. There are some questions about how realistic it is to hope that food gardens can plug some of the gaps in the food system. In terms of your experience through this, what have been some of the hurdles that you've encountered? For instance, around unlocking or accessing the resources that we were talking about a minute ago. What are some of the hurdles you've encountered and how did you overcome them so that we can come up with some solutions here?
Right. Thanks, Leonie, and good afternoon to everyone who's listening on the talk this afternoon. So firstly, I think what I'd like to point out, particularly when it comes to being able to access and unlocking resources, to be able to help ameliorate the problem, I think that we've only had very partial success in that, so we have obviously, we now, the latest figures I've seen on COVID-19 280,000 accessing 350 Rand a month. That isn't a large amount of money that is being introduced into the system in order to be able to help people with food security. So that's quite a limited impact there. And then there are also the additional efforts that are being made, such as the City of Cape Town Mayor's Relief Fund. There is also, what we're starting to see now, there is, a longer term plan that is now looking like it, was incredibly timeous, has been the investment by the City of Cape Town into the Philippine Economic Development Initiative project of 40 million Rand in order to be able to help upscale the productive capacity of that facility, but in terms of their capacitation of farmers, as well as obviously the provision of supporting infrastructure that's required for supply chain integration, so obviously processing, refrigeration, transport, etc. But I think, those kinds of successes are still, we're not going to find a silver bullet out of any one of them. There's always going to need to be a multi-layered approach to being able to address this. And some of the other things that I think myself and Andrew and various others have been having conversations very recently with some of the community action networks and various other parties as well who've been engaged in developing food voucher systems that we ourselves were also involved with in the beginning of the lockdown. So, there are a variety of different ways that this is going to need to work out. And one of those things is going to be an agricultural side of things as well. And certainly the conversations that we've been having with municipal officials around that at this point in time is that yes, we recognize that this is one of the things that needs to happen, but there is also a lot of caution around it as well. And that caution is justified. At the end of the day, our municipalities across the country, not just in the Western Cape, are financially very constrained. In fact, we only have one province that is operating in the black, or the rest are operating in the red. Many bankrupt municipalities across the country, and land resources are an important part of the city's long-term financial viability agenda, because they can obviously leverage it for, in order to be able to free up additional finance. They can obviously sell it. It needs to also fit into longer term spatial development framework approaches and to housing approaches. So in terms of making land available, particularly for urban agricultural activities, a lot of the time you're going to find that municipal officials are pretty hesitant to do that on land that isn't secured. So secured land, there's a lot of that kind of work that's already taking place. That would be on premises in schools or around hospitals and clinics. That kind of stuff is very much available. But given the fact that we have, if you look at the City of Cape Town, for example, unprecedented level of land invasion and over 200 so far this year down alone. And that situation is deeply problematic for city officials, because on the one hand, there's definitely an interest in terms of, okay, how do we make land available for people so that they can use it for agricultural purposes? But on the other hand, how do we do so and not lose it into a land invasion process at the same time? So that side of things, I think, is a very key question that's going to need to be asked. But I think, you know, one of the things that you were mentioning at the start of your intro here was about sort of the systems analysis side of things. And, you know, realistically, what we're going to need to do is to have an approach towards both our agricultural and productive side of things, as well as our food security side of things, that is much more cognizant of the broader contextualization that we've got. And I think that really what I'm referring to there is the broader sustainability challenge that we face. And that is from a finance perspective, but it is also from a biological perspective as well. You know, so I don't think it's news to anyone that the crisis that we're presently in directly there has been emanating of biological crisis that we, as a human race, are engaged in. It's our encroachment on the natural world that is resulting in viruses jumping across from the natural world into space. And in fact, 75% of new diseases since the 1970s have all been zoonotic, so they've jumped over from as a result of this engagement around biodiversity. So the question really then does become, you know, how do we reevaluate both our lived environments and our urban spaces, as well as our productive systems, in the context of a broader sustainability challenge that is simply monumental. So I think that we really have to ground these conversations in that kind of level of thinking.
Veronica, I'm going to ask you a quick question and welcome your input on this. So Veronica, in one of your in your presentation, you mentioned how the economic shutdown had impacted small farmers, mostly in terms of they lost their access to markets. So they had this fresh produce they needed to sell. There were customers who needed to buy it, but they couldn't get access to this food. And then, of course, the farmers lost their income, which is, for a small business, is really difficult to survive a cash flow shortage. In terms of, if we want to think about changing the supply chain in the long term so that it is more resilient to absorb a shock like this, and so that small farmers can still thrive within this context where they are much more vulnerable than a large operator that might have more cash flow, what needs to happen at the supply chain in order to help farmers thrive?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody listening to this talk. Thank you so much, Leanne, for the question. I think the most important thing that needs to be done to the food chain stores is to lift the restrictions on their exception of small farmers to supply them, because there's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of paperwork that is needed when one is supplying the vegetables. So because of that, a lot of young farmers like me are unable to supply them. So if in the future, if they can lift all those restrictions and just make it simple, if you approach them, then there's a simpler way of getting to supply the chain store, that would be highly, highly appreciated.
Okay. And Veronica, if you and for instance, your colleagues within the cooperative wanted easier access to the informal market within the cities that are nearest to you, what would allow for easier access to the informal markets?
I think there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of paperwork needed. You have this certificate, you have that certificate. If it could be just like I, as a small farmer, approach a chain store, and then they like giving us easy access would really be appreciated, because it's not easy when you approach this one will send you to the other person will send you to the next one, and you end up just like giving up and not even doing it, because you know that you'll be pushed left, right, center, and the paperwork that they're asking is difficult to access. If also the department can also educate us as young farmers on how and what to do when you want to supply the chain stores, that will also be highly appreciated.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here is municipalities need to relook at their policies to see whether they lubricate the kind of movement of food, but at the same time, the private sector also needs to look at its own policies around how it takes produce from farmers. One of the things that comes through very clearly in the African Centre for Cities analysis of the urban food system is that municipalities tend to favour the formal market. So they see supermarkets and shopping malls as this kind of poster child of what a modern African city should look like. And I think, Andrew, I'm going to bring this question to you. If we want our cities to acknowledge the importance of the informal food market within cities, and I mean, this comes through in the African Centre for Cities research, and it comes through in all of the dialogues, the importance of the informal market to meet the needs, particularly of lower income communities. So we know that this is the case, but we need our municipalities to properly engage with this, to acknowledge the importance of the informal food sector, make it less red tape heavy, and somehow enable the informal food market to thrive. But of course, you've also said that municipalities struggle with capacity, etc. How do we get this message into the local municipality and integrated within its planning and thinking?
It's not just Leonie, it's not just a question of municipal capacity. It's a matter of public policy, deliberate public policy, and the question then is, whose mandate is that? And strictly speaking, if you go back to, sections 4 and the parts of the Constitution which describes the mandates of municipalities and what they may or may not spend their money on, doesn't mention, the sort of things that you're talking about. It's limited to sort of management of informal traders. It's sort of just one little tiny element of it, so that you get two responses. As you said, either at the political level, it's kind of leave it up to the markets. Competition between the formal supermarkets will drive down prices and make food more accessible. That would be your conventional response. And partly that's reinforced by the municipal mandate, which derives its revenue from its property base. So why surrender, the formal property market and support the informal when it doesn't bring in as much revenue? A lot of policies tend to default to what is good for the municipal rates base or the income streams, which have been hit by COVID. So municipalities will tend to say, our job is to supply basic services. We can't afford to jeopardize our revenue to supply water and electricity and sanitation and roads and things like that. And therefore, we're not going to take on an additional mandate. It's someone else's mandate. Or we only, and going back to your earlier point, we're dealing with a system here, from production and processing and packaging through to consumption and right through to management of food waste. But institutions don't start from a system view. They start from the view of their own mandates, their own budgets, their own projects, and tend to implement department by department, project by project, sphere of government by sphere of government, a scattered, fragmented approach to what requires system effort. And that's why the starting point has to be, well, how do we get the institutions within the system, from the Department of Agriculture on the production side and the rural development side, through to urban agriculture production, and its strengths and weaknesses and limitations and things like that, right through to the management of waste and the role of waste pickers. And it takes a long time to get big, slow-moving, quite blunt institutions like a city council or a provincial government or a national government, and not just in this country, all over the world, to realign themselves around the food system. Whereas other cities have done it very successfully. Barcelona, as a matter of city policy, favors municipal markets for fresh produce. It won't allow supermarkets within a certain distance of those municipal markets because it has an explicit policy from the city to protect small producers and neighborhood markets. And until you get that as a matter of explicit public policy at a municipal level, supported by other spheres of government, it's not going to happen. And so I think an intense drive, what we call navigating the authorizing environment of big, rather slow-moving institutions that are mandate-bound in a very segmented way to think system. And that needs a lot of dialogue. And yeah, it comes back to this issue of agency, because often a municipality or a city council will devise a policy internally. It may be a good or a bad or indifferent policy, and then kind of quite grudgingly go out for public comment, usually a bit of a tick box exercise, and then kind of return back into the big institution, which tends to be funneled inwards and upwards rather than downwards and outwards. And, you know, those who are on the outside of those institutions are left high and dry. And I think now that, you know, the CANS, Cape Town Together, mobilized 30,000 volunteers over the last 4 years, not just around food, but including an incredible food response. There are thousands of community kitchens. So how do we sustain not just that level of organization to help people in communities, but to also participate in public policy debates and drive public policy towards better outcomes?
Okay. I'm writing down notes frantically, so if there's a pause, it's because my brain is trying to catch up. This is really valuable. Veronica, I want to ask you quickly, in terms of the work that you're doing with your farmers, these are all individuals who are very skilled in terms of producing food. These are people who know how to grow food. What sort of skills development would they need in order to, for instance, become better business people, to become more business savvy, to better understand how to access the market? And I think most importantly, how they can strengthen their own voice within the big sort of negotiating process that needs to happen around accessing markets.
We need leadership skills, more especially in connection with the new technology that is being on board, because a lot of us emerging farmers are really behind technology-wise. There's a lot of advanced technology that is used or that is being is in use right now that us as emerging farmers, I think we don't have the knowledge of those skills. So leadership skills would be really of good help to us. Yeah.
So I want to throw in another little an example, a case study that I picked up years ago when I was researching the hungry season. And this now links, Veronica, your point with what Andrew was saying earlier around who has a voice and who has a sense of agency within the system. So, and let's think about how to boost the voice of those who have less agency. The example comes from Prince Albert. So I was visiting there many years ago, and what used to happen on what they call all pay day, which is the day social grants get paid out, usually the grant would get paid out in the local municipality at some municipal office. And on that day, a whole little thriving business community would pop up around the municipal building. A lot of small traders, little bucky traders. And so individuals would go into collect the social grant, they would come out and they would immediately then buy groceries from these informal traders on the roadside, who would often give them the additional service of taking this food home for them. And this was a wonderful way for money to come from the state into the local economy, and then it would stay within the local economy and circulate. And then what happened was one of the big retailers, I think it was ShopRite or Spar or someone, negotiated with the state to assist the state by using its private infrastructure to assist with social grant payout. So what then happened was individuals would go into the local Spar or Checkers, get their social grant, and then they would stay within the shop and spend the money within the shop. And then, of course, all of that money would go out of the community and back into the national profits of the big chain. And this is just an example of, and of course, the small traders who would ordinarily have been working the business on the pavements were now cut out of the loop, and the money was not staying in the community. And this is just a small example to indicate what happens when you have a lot of agency within the system. Large retailers are well positioned to speak with government and offer their infrastructure, influence policy. The small bucky trader on the side of the road in a little Karoo town does not have that. So I think, Gray, I don't know if you would like to jump in here. How do we work within the system to give these smaller communities more voice and access to the corridors of power that these large corporations just assume is theirs? And yes, you've taken your mute off. Good.
Indeed. Sure. It's a complex question, you know, and the reality is that there's been a number of trends within the value chain that are important to look at. One is that all of our retailers in South Africa have centralized their distribution model. In fact, the only one that allows any centralized are. Pick and Pay occasionally does so on some very specific items, but outside of individual Spar stores, there's Spars at two different ownership models. And outside of the ones that are sort of independently owned, those are all linked into their central supply chain, and all of those, I mean, so like the Longmeadow facility in Johannesburg, for example, I think that's phase one. That's absolutely huge. And if you're not in a position where you can supply the kind of scale that would need to meet into their centralized distribution model, you don't have too much of a chance. So then the question then becomes, okay, so where would you intersect small scale producers into the food system? And I mean, I understand Veronica's frustration about being able to wanting to access the, you know, the retail sectors, and about the frustration of having to go through all of the paperwork and you need to have this form and that form. But the reason why that's there is because of the fact that the Consumer Protection Act places the onus on the provider of the food in order to be able to prove it's, so if you get sick, if you bought a pie at Pick and Pay, you eat that pie, you get sick, and you decide to go and sue Pick and Pay, the onus is on Pick and Pay to prove that their pie did not make you sick. That is the way that the Consumer Protection Act works in this country. And as a result, the only way for retailers to be able to protect themselves is to be able to ensure that there's full traceability on every bit of food that they sell. And this is one of those areas where I really think that, you know, what Veronica was saying around, you know, the capacitation around technological innovation within the food system space. Yes, absolutely. I think that there's some tremendous programs like that. I mentioned the investment in PEDI, but also at a national level, we've, you know, we've had these agri-parks that were meant to act as these agricultural development zones that have been in the offing for, I think, what, 6 or 7 years now, with not a hell of a lot of development taking place within this. Unfortunately, I think those processes have been less than efficient from a national government perspective to be able to get them integrated, but they definitely are required. But what is also needed outside of the technological innovation is also the business skills development around processes like Local Gap, for example. So Local Gap is a formalized training process that allows small-scale farmers to be able to cheaply and effectively engage in certification that meets the requirements of the Consumer Protection Act. So that side of things, and unfortunately, I'm a bit rusty on the details of local gap now, but the last time I checked on this, which was probably in 2016, they only had one office in the country. And that makes it really difficult in order to be able to provide that level of training for small-scale farmers to be able to develop their produce. There are other points of intersect, however. So if you look, for example, like Tiger Brands presently has got about, I think it's 40 million rands worth of investment in small-scale production, which they are in the process of scaling up to 100 million rands per year by 2020. I think it is. So, and similarly speaking, Old Mutual has got a small-scale farmers support and investment wing that works specifically within that sector. There's a group called UFF that works in small agri development projects and transformative agricultural products. So, like particularly around creating situations where you can integrate community ownership into larger scale production outputs that could integrate into a Parmalat or a Danone or some sort of a bigger producer. And similarly speaking, outgrow schemes have existed within the sugarcane industry, for example. So Tongaat Hewlett's has also had a long history of being able to do that as well. So I think, there are areas where it can be done. I think certainly, there is renewed interest and pressure within the urban agricultural space. And I think we're going to start to see particularly quantification of urban land resources within urban spaces for us to be able to designate areas that people could engage in agricultural development. I think that there needs to be a lot of this additional supporting skills that need to go into informing producers of where they can intersect with food value chains and the correct processes for that. And I think also at the same time, we are starting to see, particularly from manufacturers, that there is an interest in terms of being able to do this. How it is that we provide additional support for the informal sector. I think, I'd rather defer that to, people who are working in the local government space more directly, who I think, would be better placed.
So the next question is first for Andrew, because of the coordinating function that you have helped with over the past while, and then possibly Veronica, if you want to add something to this. Andrew, you were saying that the emergency is not over, that we still need humanitarian aid. And Veronica, as you were demonstrating, there are small farmers out there who are producing but may have been struggling to get food to market. So we have this gap. The food is being produced, the people who desperately need it are not able to access it. Andrew, do you have any examples of just very practically how the collapse of the formal supply chain was resolved? Were you able to find ways to pick up or coordinate communities or groups who were able to pick up food from these small farmers and take it to the humanitarian aid outlets? Or if you don't have an example of that, do you have a suggestion of how that could happen? Because it needs to be coordinated. You need logistics, you need transport, you need someone sitting on the phone. How does that happen?
Well, Leonie, we saw the rise of three different types of organization in response to the humanitarian crisis around food. And you obviously have your big formal, what I'd call your perhaps corporate food NGOs or NPOs, who have got their own supply chains and logistics. And they tended to deliver food parcels on behalf of government or the Solidarity Fund in the first part of the crisis. And just 2 points about food parcels. One is that they're very expensive. So a 700 Rand value food parcel costs 1,100 Rand to deliver because it's delivered door to door. It's to a household. And secondly, effectively using food parcels sucks resources out of local communities in the sense that that food is being sourced probably at bulk to keep the prices down outside, and not from small producers or small retailers or the informal sector, and then it brings it into communities. And I can, for a short-term relief, humanitarian disaster, yes, that's fine. I mean, I think food parcels are used all over the world, but there's limitations to that. Secondly, we saw, the tremendous grassroots organization at the local level. What Cape Town Together calls the hyper-local, decentralized, allowing for difference, so different responses in different areas. But what we notice is that you asked the question about where's the source of food, where did it come from? We saw the growth of what we call intermediary networks, who could reach out to, whether it's commercial agriculture for donations, or farmers, big and small, and set up these networks of being able to collect food more centrally and then channel it to 300, 400, 500, 600 micro sites throughout the city or throughout the province. And again, I think that we haven't seen that level of organization in the food system before. It is emergent, and it creates the opportunity to build alternatives to the formal supply chains that we have now to support small farmers like Veronica and others. And so let me just give you an example, practical example of an experiment we're working on. And the nature of all experiments, it may not succeed. But going back to your Karoo example of how do you keep resources circulating in poor and vulnerable communities rather than being sucked out into the formal sector or to the big corporate sector. And we're about to embark on a project, and it's funded by the Western Cape government as well as the DG Murray Trust. So it's kind of combining resources there. And the first part of it is quite traditional in the sense that it's providing food vouchers to community kitchens. So it's a new form of delivering resources, not through the normal food parcel. But the idea is for these hundreds of community kitchens to buy local. In other words, support local retailers, hopefully local food producers, informal traders, rather than buying outside of the community. And it's a deliberate attempt. It's called a community economic recovery project rather than a food aid project. And I think the virtue is, hopefully, if it works out, is that yes, it brings food to people in need using community kitchens, but it also goes further than just that. And it starts looking at the notion of recovery and sustaining local food economies. And I think if we can crowd more resources into that and do it over a wider number of areas, that perhaps that experiment can take off and become more sustainable. But that's something that we would like to work with the community kitchens on, particularly in the poor and vulnerable hotspots, as well as the tremendous lists of spaza shops and local retailers and local distributors of food to link up with the community kitchens, link up with the early childhood development centers, link up with the schools. So start bringing all the players together and making it a little bit more than just food.
So what I'm hearing here is almost a need for a public-facing sort of database or of who all of these networks are, so that anyone outside of the system can look at this public-facing sort of database and see where the local network is. One quick gap that I see, and then I'm going to ask Veronica to respond. Often with this humanitarian aid and the food parcels, it's often sort of food that is, it's relatively sort of staples, so it's often a highly processed sort of maize or whatever, which is great for alleviating hunger in the immediate term, but it may not be a food parcel that's full of fresh produce. And of course, fresh produce, moving it around along these networks very quickly before the food perishes adds a whole nother layer of logistical challenge. So while you're wanting to deliver humanitarian aid, at the same time, you also want to make sure that those food parcels have got fresh produce in them. So dealing with that logistical thing is challenging. Veronica, from your perspective as someone who is working with farmers and as a cooperative, how have you been contacted by any of these sort of alternative networks to pick up your produce or not? And how would they find you, or how would you find them?
Thank you, Leanne. No, I've never been contacted by any of the people who do the food parcels or however, because I think if we would be, or if I was contacted, it's so easy to get the food from us. We are along N7, it's not so far on the main road. It's so also easy to identify people who need food parcels around our areas and get the fresh produce from us and deliver that direct to the areas around us. But that has never happened before. So yeah, I haven't had a chance. I'm contactable. If anybody wants to contact me, I'm contactable, but I've never been contacted.
So again, I think this is a nice example in that it shows us how there are different nodes who can help each other. They just haven't seen each other yet. And if we could help them to see each other, then that could fill a gap, both in terms of the immediacy of dealing with the humanitarian crisis, but also about building this longer term resilience around relationships and networks. Of course, relationship building often involves a lot of human skill. One can put the engineering solutions in place, etc. But this relationship building involves a whole nother level of skill. And I think that's possibly where Andrew comes in. Gray, you were talking earlier about the longer term need for a green economy. Can you join the dots between what we're learning now in terms of our COVID response and how we do need to move ourselves towards a greener economy from the context of the food system? And I mean, if you want to speak from a provincial government perspective, what needs to happen at that specific tier of government, or if you want to speak more generally at a national level?
Yeah, thanks, Leonie. So firstly, I wanted to say, just in terms of, you mentioned about needing to have a publicly accessible database that is information on who's doing what where within the food system. From a food security perspective, we do actually have a publicly available database like that, and I was just actually trying to look for it now in the interim. I know that Andrew has the details somewhere to pass the buck here to Andrew. Sorry about that, throwing you under the bus there. But that does exist. Certainly, I think in terms of broader agricultural support and sort of training support side of things, that's still something that is missing and something that we should definitely look at. But in terms of how the green economy side of things works into this, there are a couple of key points that feed into this. So I mean, and the one is that you need to recognize that and let's start at the very macro level, and that is that we live on a finite planet. There is only a certain amount of arable land. In fact, there's only a certain surface area of the globe, and that is not getting any more. And unfortunately for us to be able to survive at 7 billion people, the amount of land resources, and this actually, so when I say land resources, I actually include the oceans in this as well, because we can quantify how productive the oceans are. We can quantify how productive the land is in terms of the key things that we need to survive, including food, obviously, material resources, fiber, metals for mining, for the different industries that we want to be able to support modern life. And that figure at 7 billion people is 1.7 global hectares per capita. And that includes no land whatsoever for conservation, none. Now, the challenge with that is that we are presently sitting on 2.3, as the global average is presently 2.3 global hectares per capita. So we need to find a way in order to be able to increase the level of agricultural production, as well as associated, and not just from food base, but also from a broader natural resource base. We need to be able to increase our productive capacity on a massive level. And as far back as 2013 already, organizations such as UNCTAD, the United Nations Trade and Development Group, have been saying about the fact that the only way that we can meet humanity's needs for natural resources, particularly agricultural output, is through agroecological production. And agroecological production is most effectively done through small-scale farmers because it's intensive, it is more complex than agro-industry, and it produces multiple different products on the same plot of land with far less material inputs and also at the same time far less energy intensive inputs. So one of the bigger concerns that we've got here is that, this is why I say we need to have this conversation within the broader systems perspective, and that is that we can survive COVID, and we can survive the economic fallout that we're going through as a result of the shutdown, the lockdown, but we are screaming towards a over 2 degrees centigrade world. We are absolutely full ball on speed with that. And the thing that really concerns me when we have conversations around climate change is that our conversation focuses on energy, and everybody sits there and says, we've got to leave the coal in the hole, and we need to turn off the coal-fired power plants, and no more coal funding. Great. But if we switched off every single internal combustion engine and coal-fired power plant, every single carbon-emitting source of power and electricity in the world tomorrow, we would still exceed our carbon budget, because the biggest area of carbon emissions in the world is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. That is the biggest, bigger than any.
Yeah. So can I just, sorry, I just want to interrupt you there, because I don't want to get too far off the food thing. What I do, I want to just join the dots between something that you said now and the emerging theme that's coming through in today's discussion, and that is the issue of localization of the food system. And one of the things that concerns me a great deal about the current food system is that it creates an environment in which highly processed and basically energy dense but nutritionally dead food prevails. And this is why we have this is why the food system leaves many of us hungry, heavy, and sick. And of course, the food system is dominated by industrial food producers who are able to produce this at bulk, on scale, very cheaply. And I think one of the things that strikes me around this idea of a much more localized food supply chain is that it's going to be a much less processed diet, because your small scale producers who are producing multiple different crops are not likely to take those crops and put them through these massive industrial systems that process them and end up producing packaged food at the end. So ultimately, a more localized system is going to be creating more jobs within communities and supporting better nutrition as well. The question is always how we get there, how we take a system that is dominated by big players where they have a huge amount of agency and shift it so that these smaller operators are able to thrive. Yeah, that's a very hard one to do. And I think also it comes down, Andrew, your point around so how do we get smaller operators to have more voice within negotiating how the system works? And how do we again then build trust in such a way that these different parties, I don't know, sit in the same room together and talk?
Can
yes.
I make one comment on that,
yes.
please, Leonie? I think, the reason why I chose that particular lens to answer your question with is because of the fact that I think that it's not just from a climate perspective that we need to be able to make this transition towards smaller, more localized production happen. And interestingly enough, by the way, the two leading examples of sustainability globally are Cuba and Sri Lanka in terms of meeting the metrics. There are three key metrics, which is global hectares per capita, Gini coefficient, and human development index. And Sri Lanka and Cuba both meet them. And in both cases, one of the things that is very central is localized production and consumption of food. And particularly in the case of Cuba, their situation has been mass levels of urban food production as well. And the thing that, I mean, like the one thing that what we haven't really mentioned here is the role that consumers play within this discussion. You know, because Veronica mentioned now about the fact that no one has approached her in order to be able to integrate her fresh produce into feeding schemes. Believe you me, when I was sitting on the food security task team, I was absolutely busting my gut in order to be able to do what I could in order to be able to integrate fresh produce into the food basket delivery system, because I mean, and that was something that was absolutely available to us via the Philippi Economic Development Initiative as a trial point from where we would have ideally liked to have been able to expand it because of obviously the key things around micronutrients that are not being incorporated or seen to as well in much of the food security response. And the reality is that we got pushback because of the fact that what people would rather focus on is exactly like you say, the energy dense but nutritionally poor food, and that's from the consumptive perspective. So the need to engage with consumer behavior is really also going to be a critical factor in how it is that we manage to navigate this divide.
I do remember visiting a few food banks over the years, which of course, you know, involves humanitarian aid, and a lot of what was stocked inside the warehouses was, you know, highly processed food, which didn't really have any nutritional value, which was interesting. Veronica, to come back to you, your farmers who are now trying to weather the storm have probably been through 4 months now where they have battled to sell and have had major cash flow problems. Are they recovering? How are they coping? And what additional support would be necessary to weather a crisis like this beyond just, say, a social grant or getting cash flowing again? How else can one support farmers like that?
Thank you so much, Leanne, for the question. The most necessary support for me, Leanne, is markets, more markets, because we are not recovering yet. I can give you an example of myself. I'm pruning almost every day. Fortunately for me, I've got animals. The animals eat them. But for people who don't have animals, all that food is going to waste. So for me, the emphasis is markets. If chain shops like ShopRite, Pick and Pay, Spar, and the rest can at least easen up the buying, like the rules on the buying from the emerging farmers, that could be so nice. Because right now, if you've got a lower quantity, I approached Spar at one point. I was told, no, we would need like 100 kgs, 1,000 kgs every day. And I told them I was not on the capacity of doing that. I can supply you 200 or 300 kgs every day. And I was turned down because I couldn't meet that 1,000 kgs per day. So if they could, just open for us whatever quantity you have, or maybe group ourselves up, and then they tell us, okay, every day if you bring us so much, it would be really, really appreciated. And us as emerging farmers, well, we're asking for the chance to just allow us, sign a contract with us, even if it's a small amount. We'd put ourselves together to at least give them the kilos that they need. But instead, we just get just pushed away, and that's it. And then we remain without a solution.
So thank you, Veronica. Your story is something that I've picked up on so many times over the years, this frustration of small farmers not being allowed into this formal food system. I'm just wondering, Andrew, given your experience with dealing with sort of mediating these kinds of conversations, which is very much about relationship building, how do we get the private food sector to engage with the informal market more? I mean, let's say hypothetically Pick and Pay were to decide that it wanted to really foster small farmers, and it put within its organization a department that was specifically around procuring from small farmers in a way that sidesteps the current restrictions. So small farmers often say they can't meet the contractual bulk supply demands of most of these big retailers, which is why they always cut out of it. You know, do we need to ask the pick and pays to have a bespoke department within the organization that specifically encourages small farmers into the value chain?
Leonie, I don't know how they are organized, the big food retailers. I think a lot of them would claim to already have done that and already have bespoke supply agreements with small farmers and small producers and things like that. It clearly isn't enough, or it's not working. And I think if, for example, if we say that, going back to your point about localization as one of the approaches, it's not the only approach, but it's one of a suite of approaches, localization of food supply chains and local markets, as Veronica also talked about. So my first question, not being a food person, so I'm kind of asking this to everyone, what policies and public investments favor this localization approach? And secondly, whose job is this within government? Because in other words, who takes on the role of driving a food system policy within government? You know, which includes supporting localization, supporting small, supporting informal, given the fragmentary functions and mandates within government, because it's no one's job title is alternative food systems policy. Maybe there's someone who's worried about nutrition in the health department, and maybe someone's worried about production in the agricultural department, but those things don't easily come together as a systemic approach. And so I think in our experience too, we've got to be very, very explicit within this quite fragmented and often incapable state, which and has been revealed by the crisis to be more incapable, unfortunately for all of us. Who plays this convening role? Who brings all the role players together, including the private sector or the informal economy and things like that? And who then runs quite a complex engagement role, whether it's with civil society organizations, informal economies, small scale producers, which in itself has a host of complexities there. Engages with highly competitive, vertically integrated food retailers who don't sit in the same room as each other because they are so competitive with each other, and will engage one-on-one, maybe with government. So, you know, it's a tall order, you know, and I think that the window of opportunity, as I tried to say in my talk, is closing. But I think right now, if the forces that want us to be able to transform our food and nutrition system, move quickly to work together, and that's the academics and the researchers and the policy people in the universities and the networks that have been doing incredible research for years, but often that research is not absorbed into government at all. It has no impact or influence on political policy, government policy, and things like that. The incredible civil society organizations that have been there and have emerged, together with many officials who want to try and make a change within government. In other words, it's, you know, to regard government as monolithic is also a problem. One has to work with people in government that are prepared to reach out and engage, at the same time perhaps show up or challenge the command and control top-down attitudes of this authorizing environment. And it does often require, when you're dealing with complex situations like that, it does help to have intermediaries in place. And I'm not just saying that because I work for an intermediary organization. There are many others that probably are better placed in the food system to do this. But it's someone who focuses on that in-between space, in between civil society, small producers, informal, government, big retail, formal corporate, et cetera, because at the moment, no one seems to be convening that space and bringing it together, not just for dialogues. There's nothing wrong with this dialogue, but how do you turn dialogue into action? And that's what we're missing at the moment in this space.
Thank you. That's really valuable. a couple of examples that have come through over the years of why urban food gardens fail. And possibly this again raises the need for some practical solutions around this. So often city level food security policy is just about supporting the urban farmer with inputs, seed, land, whatever. Whereas the food gardens that tend to thrive are those that rather than just give people produce or the opportunity to produce produce, they give the opportunity to give employment. So people want to work for a wage so that they can go and buy food rather than grow their own food. And Leonie Joubert is one of the models that works extremely well. So there's a support for community gardeners. They produce fresh produce, they take half of it home, but then they are supported with accessing the market for the remaining half of their produce. And that means that they earn cash at the same time as have food to take home, which makes it a far more thriving business model. And I'm thinking now about, but it required an NGO to step in and become that intermediary. So I'm thinking that there needs to be some conversations after this around who those intermediaries are going to be. Gray, I just want to ask would you like to jump in and say something about intermediaries within your own experience of this crisis? Have you had, do you have some examples of intermediaries that you have encountered through this COVID crisis?
Yeah, look, I mean, the main intermediaries that I can think of that I would put forward at this point in time is the group out of Haiti. You know, they're doing fantastic work in terms of essentially what has happened was that Leonie Joubert originally had this dual-fold approach in terms of providing a capacitation, and then also through Harvest of Hope, what they were doing is that they were then providing access to market as well for the scale producers. And what's happened is that essentially that function, the Harvest of Hope function, has moved wholesale over to Pedi as an entity, which is, I think, preferable, because what that allows Leonie to do is focus exclusively on the provision of training for small-scale producers, which they do at unbelievably cheap rates. Their training costs 70 Rand and provides people with the seedlings and the key things that they need to in order to be able to get going and to get a home garden going. And one of the things that we're looking at provincial level is that we're looking at how it is that we can align the training that our Department of Agriculture provides to Elsenburg, because they also do small-scale farmer training. They also do small-scale commercial farmer training, but nowhere near at the same kind of economic viability and the economic efficiency that Leonie is doing. So I think, creating that partnership from our side would be highly beneficial. Also linking into city developmental programs, and particularly around mapping our land resources. And then at the same time, looking at what it is that we can do to be able to scale organizations like Pedi or the Agri-Parks programs that can help provide the cold chain, that can help provide manufacturing facilities and beneficiation facilities, that can provide access to markets, that can act as, that can have leverage a bit of their capacity to generate to scale in order to be able to create opportunities for people like Veronica to then sell her 200 or 300 kilograms worth of production every day into a bigger basket of goods that can then be integrated into a retail supply chain.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So I want to give each one of you an opportunity to just give a closing statement. One sort of take-home message that you think your community or South Africa needs to think about in terms of moving beyond this crisis and thinking about systemic change in the food system in the long term. The one thing that seems to come through from what all of you have said is the need for, let's frame it as local economic development. through the lens of the food system. How to create communities that are thriving economically, that are relatively self-sustaining, are not waiting for government to create that environment for them. Veronica, would you like to just make a closing statement from your experience of COVID and where we go from here?
Yes. Thank you, Len. First and foremost, I would like to say, if we could be provided with land, lack of land is one thing. You know, farming without land is so frustrating. For example, myself, I'm renting now, and with this poverty, sometimes I fail to pay my landlord and tell him to wait for the following month, which is also frustrating for him because it's depending on the money that I give him. And I also think government must link up with emerging farmers, with the formal markets, and hospitality industrial, and supply to the government departments like educational, healthy, and correctional services. Also, if they could have a way of buying in cash from us, because as an emerging farmer, if you have to supply somebody for the whole month and then you just wait, then you run short on the cash to run the business. So if they could have a way of doing that as well. Yeah, and also if we could be allowed to go 50-50, or not 50-50, or 50-30 with the commercial farmers on the supply of the chain stores, that would be really, really appreciated.
I think maybe that might be one community that is missing from the dialogues this year, is some of the big food corporations. Andrew, would you like to make a concluding statement?
Yeah, thanks, Leonie. It's pretty much directed at the public sector, and I think a couple of things. One, the government needs to recognize that food and nutrition security is government business, but it's got to go beyond feeding. I mean, until the crisis, government was spending, I'm talking about national government, 7 billion rand a year just on feeding people through the schools feeding scheme and the ECD centers and things like that. That is not sustainable in the long term. We need to change the food and nutrition system. Secondly, government can't do that on its own, and nor can civil society or the informal sector on its own. To solve complex problems, you need to recognize that no one sector can do it on its own. Public policy on its own is not going to work. Food gardens on their own are not going to work. I think we need to have a joined up approach. So that means we've got to start talking about some attitudinal and behavioral changes. We need to shift to a more collaborative, adaptive, and enabling approach, away from the kind of disabling command and control hierarchical attitudes and behaviors that we find in large parts of government. We need a partnering framework within government, between the silos, between the spheres of government. And then we need to completely change the approach within government to what is called community engagement and community participation, which at the moment is just a fairly meaningless tick box exercise. And then finally, I do think there's a role in complex system change for intermediary organizations that are not government, that are not private sector, that are not community sector, that are not academic think tanks, but in the middle of those 4 or 5 sectors that can bring them all together around a common agenda for joint action.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And I just want to close off by saying, before we move on to Gray, is the private food sector apparently was invited to these dialogues and for some reason did not respond and was not available, which maybe indicates that, I don't know what it indicates, I shouldn't read anything into that, but it is a shame that they didn't arrive and participate, because the big food industry has a large role to play in helping us shift the system. And it's not just about corporations benefiting from the system, but actually helping us adapt the system so that the people who are not benefiting from that system are able to access it and thrive. I just also want to say quickly that, you know, I know we've focused a lot on food gardens and farming in this discussion. And I think it's just because Gray and both Veronica, that's an area where they have focused quite a bit. But it is important to remember that urban food gardens is really just a very, very small part of making a more resilient food system. You know, we really shouldn't just focus on urban food gardens as the silver bullet, which has often been the case. When we look at the reasons why, particularly the urban food system leaves many of us hungry, heavy and sick, it's not because there's a lack of calories in circulation. It's that they often unhealthy, cheap calories that are that people have access to, and also hoping that behavior change is going to move them away from those unhealthy calories is also a distraction. Gray, would you like to make your concluding statement, please?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to actually pick up on what it was that you were talking about there in terms of not wanting to have an exclusive focus around agricultural food production. And on a slightly different note, and in terms of the fact that it's not just parts of the types of food that people are buying, but I think there is an additional element here, and that is that broader green economy perspectives around sustainable land use and agricultural production outside of the urban zone is a really important, you know, for a city to be cognizant of its own food insecurity. We need to be cognizant of the fact that there is a core periphery relationship between the urban centers and rural areas of production. And for us to be able to get those rural areas of production to be effectively integrated into city systems, one of the things that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to look at creating multiple layers of income generation for people who are active on those peripheral sections of land. And I think that what that requires is having a much more imaginative sense about how it is that we can create value, particularly around rural land, and being able to facilitate that kind of value generation for people who be involved in transformative land use management strategies.
Thank you very much. My concluding statement, if I may make one, is that, you know, what has come through from researchers like those at the African Centre for Cities over the years is that ensuring that households are food secure, that they've got healthy, nutritious food, is not just about getting more calories out of the soil. It's about making sure that people have jobs or livelihoods or social grants so that they have cash so that they can buy food and access the food system. That's key. So much of dealing with the emergency of hunger is about making sure people can access the food that is in circulation and ensuring that that food is healthy. So it's not just about production. It's not just about getting more calories in circulation. So I want to thank all three of our panelists today. Your input has been extremely valuable. Kurt, I'm going to hand back over to you so you can prime everyone for the rest of this fantastic week that's lined up.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Leonie, and thank you to our panelists. That was just a fascinating conversation, and fortunately, we have more time throughout the week to talk about other aspects of this. I think tomorrow's talk, in particular, tomorrow's panel discussion on food politics, will pick up nicely from some of the threads here in terms of the kinds of organizations and the dynamics around governance. We're fortunate that that is going to be moderated by Florian Kroll, who is one of the facilitators with the community of practice in food systems governance that's happening, and really is a very important grouping and platform for taking some of these conversations into action, as Andrew encouraged us all to do. So I think that's a compelling reason for all of us to engage tomorrow as well. I want to wrap. It is 4:30 now, and we're at the end of our time. I just want to make another thank you to our sponsors, the DSI NRF Center for Excellence in Food Security, the DG Murray Trust, and to our partners, the African Centre for Cities, Oribi Village, the City of Cape Town, ICLEI, and Derek. And with that, I will say until tomorrow. Thank you all.